right? Like, and that first video, you know, when you open the back of your truck and everything's all over the floor, that's how I feel sometimes, like when I drive home from the grocery store and like everything's got everywhere out of my bags.
Yeah, I mean, you know, hey, I was in LTL back in the day when you did brake checks and dock bumps to adjust the weight on the axles.
I don't know about that one, but all right.
So yeah, absolutely, we've done it that way.
All right, Christian, thanks for that. We'll get more looks at what's going on trucking social media throughout the show today. Right now, it's time to welcome our next live guest. I'm calling you our in-house historian, our FreightWaves historian, because Scott Mall's with us. He writes FreightWaves Classics, which are honestly some of the most interesting pieces that we get put up on FreightWaves now. So Scott, thanks for being here today, and thanks for the work that you do to kind of chronologue the history of transportation.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. As Donnie reminded me a few minutes ago, I've got a face that was made for radio, so being on TV is a big deal. Yeah, Craig and I talked about this a couple of years ago. I had started as the first editor, full-time editor for FreightWaves.com, but I had time to write one article a week, and it was called Friday Flashback, and it was kind of these interesting articles about things that happened in transportation history. And then later he said, well, let's do that full time. And like most of Craig's ideas, they work out. And so been doing that for a couple of years now, and it's really interesting. And I do, and Craig and I both love history, so I'm happy doing it. And I just hope that the folks on the other side of the page enjoy it as well.
I'll tell you what, you may, I don't know about face for radio, but your voice is one that I can listen to tell a story. You've got like that, not that you sound like Morgan Freeman or James Earl Jones, but you have one of those voices that I can just listen to, and I do enjoy listening to. When you look through all the classics that you've done and stuff like that, what are some of your favorite points on them?
I think one of my favorites is always going to be about Malcolm McLean, who's the inventor of the container. And books have been written about him. One of them was called The Box. And he really revolutionized transportation, not just ocean cargo, but rail and truck as well. And also he was a great entrepreneur that didn't even have a full high school education, started a trucking company in the 1930s, was very, very successful at that. And then after World War II, came up with this idea for the container. He had actually seen the U.S. Armed Services use an early version of that to get material over to Europe and into the Pacific Theater.
I was going to say, can you imagine running logistics for World War II without containers?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they were much smaller and much more rudimentary. But I wrote an article just about a week and a half ago on the anniversary of D-Day, and it was about the logistics of D-Day because it was the largest armada of ships in history. And even though they were only having to go 30 miles across the English Channel, they had to do it in secrecy, and they had to obviously get all these boats loaded in the right order. Obviously, the men and equipment had to get on shore first, but it was a huge logistical operation. And in fact, logistics started back in the Greek and Roman times for their armies. So logistics has always been kind of armed forces based, if you will.
Technically, the first container, the Trojan horse.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is.
Half joking,
Yeah,
right?
no, not half joking, because I really think it was. But, you know, there's a saying that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, an army travels on its stomach. And what that means is you've got to have the logistical capability to support that army. One of the major reasons that the Nazis lost World War II was they invaded Russia. They got almost to the gates of Stalingrad, almost to the gates of Moscow. But then the Russian winter set in. They didn't have the right equipment. They didn't have the right clothes. They didn't have the right supplies. And they lost thousands of men to the cold.
It was the blitzkrieg, really, that hurt, moving too fast for the supply chain, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly so.
So, Scott, when we kind of take a look at the history of logistics, it seems like the way that things were done with the Greek and the Romans, like they laid the baseline, right? And things are working, but there's always room for technological advancement. What are some of the things that you've maybe covered that you think are like the most crucial advancements to the way that we do logistics now, besides obviously the invention of the container?
Well, I think, you know, the modes of transportation, the invention of the steam engine, which led to the steamboat and then to railroads, and you know, in today's world, railroads just aren't that important. But for about 80 years, They were the primary source of transportation, not just in the United States, but around the world. And then obviously the invention of the automobile, which led to the invention of trucks. And over the years, of course, automobiles and trucks have gotten much more sturdy. They can carry more. And, you know, a man named Fruhoff invented the trailer. You know, that now you see millions of trailers all over the world. So a lot of it is transportation and what's going on in those modes. And as I mentioned earlier, the container used in all those modes. And of course, the airplane came along and air cargo. Really the reason that the airlines were able to survive the first 15 or 20 years of their existence was they carried mail for the US government, air mail, and that's where they made their money. They couldn't make money carrying 1 or 2 passengers in those tiny little planes.
So they were carrying the mail and then sold passengers on top of it.
Exactly.
And now they carry passengers and sell cargo underneath it.
Exactly. It's kind of reversed over the last 100 years.
Let me ask you this, Scott. What's going to be a classic in 20, 30 years in logistics?
Well, I think FreightWaves is going to be first and foremost, and I don't say that just because we work here. I think some of the things that we have done as a company really have changed the transportation world. But there are all kinds of technologies coming online that will be looked back upon as groundbreaking. And what's interesting is, of course, technology continues to feed on itself, meaning railroads were, you know, the primary transportation mode for 80 years. And now for something to be the primary transportation mode, it might be for 10 or 15 years because technology keeps improving things. So even with the older modes of transportation, technology is there making them better every day. And that's good for all of us. The container cut the cost of shipping by about 85% when it first took hold. Yeah. So these things just happen. There are people all over the world thinking of ways to make something better every day, and it just continues to increase in speed.
Before we let you go, Scott, I've got one more question for you. So we think about some of these legacy companies. I'm thinking like the J.B. Hunts, the Warners, the Fruhoffs, the trailer manufacturers. Is there anyone that you see doing things today and you're like, I love the transformation that you made from the company that you were when you started to where you are now?
Well, I was the vice president of marketing and communications 25 plus years ago for Ryder. When I worked for Ryder, it was a very different company than it is today. I think some of the things that company is doing are transformational, but I think most of these companies that are successful today are successful because they've adapted to whatever the circumstances are, and they try to stay a little bit ahead or as far ahead as they possibly can of the market. So the Old Dominions of the world and the Ryders and all that, they are leading the pack, J.B. Hunt, et cetera, because they embrace the technology and look for ways to keep improving it over time.
Well, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for the work that you do to kind of catalog the history of transportation and logistics. You can find his stuff up on FreightWaves.com. Just search FreightWaves Classics. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more FreightWaves Now in just a few minutes.